The true cost of military rule, however, isn't just economic. It is deeply social and psychological. The usurpation of civilian governance structures erodes the very social contract that binds a nation. When tanks roll into the capital and soldiers take over TV stations announcing the suspension of a country's constitution, the message sent to the citizenry is that their voices, expressed through the ballot or civil dialogue, do not matter. That despite the promises of democracy, power can be seized at gunpoint, negating the people's will. The resultant erosion of trust in public institutions is hard to quantify, but constitutes perhaps the most corrosive aspect of military interventions. It is a betrayal of the public trust, the effects of which reverberates through generations. It's a self-perpetuating cycle. Authoritarian regimes and military coups create environments ripe for more of the same. The promise of stability and quick solutions to deeply ingrained problems may make military interventions appealing in the short term, but history shows that such regimes are more likely to perpetuate cycles of violence, corruption, and poverty. The aspiration for change becomes mired in a quagmire of authoritarian governance, creating disillusionment and apathy, further undermining the democratic process. So, what is the alternative? The answer is not straightforward but starts with building strong, transparent, and accountable civilian institutions that truly represent the will of the people. It involves reinvigorating the public discourse and civic participation, strengthening judicial systems, and ensuring that governance is both decentralized and representative. It is a tall order, but anything less perpetuates a cycle that Africa can ill afford to continue. Gabon's situation thus serves as both a warning and a call to action, a real-time unfolding of challenges that countless other African nations face. To interrupt this poisonous cycle of military rule, power must not reside in the hands of a few generals, but should be public, participatory, and accountable. If the goal is a governance model that serves its citizens rather than subjugates them, then power must be returned to where it truly belongs, with the people. Lambasting the roots, corrupt politicians, and poor governance. As Gabon grapples with its political upheaval, it is worth emphasizing that while military coups are symptomatic of dysfunctional governance, they are not the root cause. The real culprits often sit in well-furnished offices, donning business suits rather than military uniforms. The corruption and poor governance that serve as fertile grounds for military interventions are in large part the work of politicians who exploit their positions for personal gain at the expense of public trust and welfare. According to Transparency International, the majority of African countries score below 50% on corruption indices. This alarming statistic points to a pervasive issue that transcends national boundaries, seeping into the very fabric of governance across the continent. And corruption is not a victimless crime. Its consequences are tangible and devastating. It exacerbates inequality, deepens poverty, and leads to social unrest. When politicians misappropriate public funds, manipulate electoral processes, and govern without transparency or accountability, they set the stage for the kind of instability that makes military interventions seem like a lesser evil to a desperate populace. In this context, corrupt politicians are not just passive contributors, but active instigators of political instability. They create an environment in which the frustrations of the masses become so intense that the drastic measures of a coup may even attract public support or at least resignation to the idea that it can't get any worse. Such politicians perpetuate a form of governance that is antithetical to the principles of democracy, setting the stage for a cycle of instability that is difficult to break. But let us be unequivocally clear. While poor governance creates an environment ripe for military intervention, replacing one form of flawed rule with another is not the solution. Military coups offer the illusion of swift justice and stability, but they fail to address the root causes of a nation's problems. In many cases, they only serve to perpetuate them. So, where do we go from here? The long-term antidote to the vulnerability of democratic systems to both corruption and military interventions is quite simple. Better governance is the answer. This involves establishing robust, transparent institutions that truly represent the people and are accountable to them. It means building a culture of political integrity where corruption is not merely punished, but is socially and morally unacceptable. It requires a shift in political culture from one that sees public office as a route to personal enrichment to one that views it as a sacred trust. If the ultimate goal is to preclude the need for military interventions altogether, the solution must start with tackling the endemic corruption and poor governance that make such drastic measures appear necessary in the first place. The true power for change does not lie in the barrel of a gun, but in the will of the people, exercised through democratic institutions that are both participatory and accountable. Only then can the cycle of coups and poor governance be broken, allowing for a future where the stability and well-being of nations are secured through the ballot box, not the bullet. The rightful owners of power, the masses. In any authentic democratic setting, the true owners of power should not be a handful of political elites, military generals, or influential oligarchs. It should be the masses. The foundation of a functioning democracy rests on the principle that power emanates from the people who should exercise it freely through transparent and fair elections. It is a simple concept, but one that has been conspicuously absent in countries where power struggles and military coups, such as the one in Gabon, steal headlines and thwart progress. In a landscape often marred by corruption, lack of accountability, and autocratic tendencies, the question is, how can the people reclaim their rightful role as the bearers of political power? The answer is multifaceted, involving both institutional reforms and cultural shifts. But it undeniably starts and ends with participatory governance. Transparent elections aren't just a democratic ideal, they are a democratic necessity. Without them, citizens are stripped of their fundamental rights to choose their leaders and, by extension, their future. Rigged electoral systems that perpetuate the reign of corrupt leaders are an affront to these rights and serve as breeding grounds for the instability that often culminates in military interventions. Accountability is another pillar of governance that needs to be fortified. Leaders should be held to their promises, scrutinized for their actions, and subjected to the rule of law like any other citizen. Without accountability mechanisms, the democratic process turns into an empty ritual rather than an effective tool for change. This requires an empowered civil society, robust media institutions, and independent judicial system that can serve as checks and balances against the misuse of power. Conclusion: a wake-up call for democratic governance in Africa. The attempted coup in Gabon serves not just as a chilling reminder of the fragile state of democracy on the continent, but also as a definitive wake-up call. It underscores the urgent need to confront and decisively deal with the issues that plague many African nations: rampant corruption, pervasive poor governance, and enduring economic instability. While the allure of quick fixes like military coups may be tempting, the reality is that the problems Africa faces cannot and should not be resolved through the barrel of a gun. As we engage in this necessary and overdue scrutiny of our political systems, we must remember to direct our most strident criticisms not only at the military officers who execute these coups, but also at the politicians whose mismanagement and corruption create the breeding ground for such actions. Their misconduct and failure in governance paved the way for the very instability that they then claim to combat. It is easy to place blame solely on these actors, but we must take the narrative a step further by looking at what the solution should be. The answer lies not in replacing one form of flawed governance with another, but in a transformative approach to how we view power and governance. The remedy is multidimensional and centers on transparency, accountability, and an empowered, active citizenry that can demand more and better from those who govern them. The onus isn't just on political leaders, but also on the general populace to actively engage in democratic processes. A populace that is educated about its rights and responsibilities is the bedrock of any thriving democracy. Equally, institutions, be it civil society organizations, the judiciary, or the media, must be strengthened and given the independence they must need to effectively check the excesses of government. Moreover, the international community also plays an integral role. Its mandate shouldn't just be to intervene when the damage has been done, but to also help in creating sustainable systems that prevent the inception of such disasters in the first place. International bodies can offer frameworks, provide oversight, and even impose sanctions to ensure that the democratic process is respected and upheld. Finally, it is prudent to remember the timeless words of Nelson Mandela. The people must lead and the government must follow. For Africa to realize its full potential and break free from the vicious cycle of military interventions, coups, and political instability, it must heed these words and return power to its rightful owners, the masses. Only by doing this can we hope to tread a path towards sustainable development, economic prosperity, and the kind of democracy that not only uplifts nations but dignifies its people.